developing a framework for the operationalization of the Paris Agreement alignment, promoting a mentoring program between institutions, delivering climate toolbox including GHG accounting, climate risk assessment, Paris Agreement alignment, and climate strategy.
Good evening for our audience here, and good afternoon for our colleagues in Europe joining us online, and good morning to our colleagues in North America. Thank you for joining us for the side event on the public bank's role in accelerating early retirement in fossil fuel assets. My name is Aki Kachi. I'm a senior climate policy analyst at New Climate Institute. And on both behalf of New Climate Institute and I4CE, I'd like to thank IDFC for hosting us here and our event today, and our various panelists for joining us. We'll start our event with a brief presentation of our research so far, focusing on the topic of early retirement of fossil fuel assets, and highlight some of our main recommendations about how public banks can engage in that space. We'll then hear with some perspectives from development banks and research organizations who will be later sharing how they think they would advise public banks to work in this space and accelerate fossil fuel phase-out efforts. And just to start with a very quick scene-setting presentation, we'll provide you some background on why supporting coal phase-out is really critical today, and share with you our understanding of how development banks should engage with different stakeholders in this space. Just so right off the bat, a bit of background. So right now, coal accounts for about 37% of global power generation. That's an all-time high, and it's going in the wrong direction still. We've made some progress in shrinking the project pipeline of new plants going forward, but we still have really large number of plants under development in the pre-construction and construction stages. But while we've moved towards phasing out and closing a lot of plants in North America and Europe, we still have a lot of new pipeline plants, or new plants in the pipeline in China, India, and Southeast Asia. In many cases already, operating existing coal-fired power plants is not competitive with building new renewables. And that there are various estimates that say that number is going to grow very rapidly in the next few years, up to 73% by 2025. And we'll talk about some of the barriers about why that's not the case everywhere in a moment. But basically, we don't see a faster fossil fuel or coal power phase out because of a number of reasons. Coal plants are insulated from market forces in a number of cases. At the same time, investors who are backing these power plants are protected from stranded assets, stranded risk assets and transition risks. And basically, I mean, it's really clear that not only do we need to shrink and stop that pipeline, but in order to reach 1.5, we need a really very fast fossil fuel phase out or coal phase out. And we've seen some encouraging text language in the current negotiation text to that effect. But yeah, we need to see a lot more. And the more we build, the more we need to phase them out early. Just going into a little bit of these transition barriers and a bit of a metaphor for that I was actually thinking about is even if it might be cheaper to buy a house than to rent a house, it doesn't necessarily mean that I can get a mortgage. It depends on my credit rating. It depends on how my current assets. It depends on my financial health. So this basic fact that buying a house might be cheaper than renting a house, building new renewables may be cheaper than renting, it doesn't mean that I can buy a new house immediately, right? And so even though it makes economic sense in a lot of cases, there are a lot of things preventing me from buying that new house. And we'll go into those in detail. But there's massive savings opportunities in basically shutting down existing coal-fired power plants and replacing them with renewables around the world. And in order to basically help countries and utilities buy the new house instead of renting houses, development banks, development finance institutions have a number of different tools at their disposal to help me get that mortgage to buy the house. And I won't go through them all. I'm sure you're very familiar with them all. But they're differently applicable to these different barriers. And we'll walk through them in a little bit more detail in a moment. There are a number of different kinds of finance that we can consider that are important in basically helping people to mobilize that finance in order to make that transition. And we consider mostly on this side. I mean, of course, in the context of a just energy transition, this issue of social issues is really very important, but it's a little bit outside the scope of our expertise. And so we're not saying it's not important, and it's a major barrier in many countries, but it's just a little bit beyond the scope of our research at this time. And at the same time, when we're thinking about providing this transition finance, it also comes with major risks, right? So in some cases, if we're mobilizing public finance to potentially buy up coal-fired power plants, that could pose a certain moral hazard, right? That sends a signal to investors that it's actually not so dangerous to invest in new coal-fired power plants because the public hand will come in and bail me out. I won't be exposed to those stranded asset risks. And maybe if I'm going to transition anyway, I will slow down those transition efforts because I will hope that someone will pay me more in order to do it than if I were going to do it anyway, right? I'm going to prove that it needs to be additional because I wouldn't have done it anyway. It's the major moral hazard and risk. And in some cases, transition finance can also basically be paying for business as usual with the label of transition finance. It really bears the question, like, if we're paying someone to close a coal-fired power plant early, what is early? What is the technical lifetime? What is the economic lifetime? Is it a question of the length of the power purchase agreement? How do we decide what is early? Is it 18 months? Is it 2 years? Is it 3 years? This is a sliding scale, and it's an important question to pose when we think about using public funds to accelerate this transition. To tell you a bit more about the top level, I will pass over to my colleague, Sarah Bandaou.
Thank you, Aki. So what we wanted to let you know as well is that considering the ownership of the coal plants, there might be different levels of engagement. So we have the national level, for example, that will encompass nationally owned utilities, but also governments, and we'll get to that a bit later in the presentation. We have the utility level for utility-owned plants. Then we have the plant level itself, with all the plants that are owned by independent power producers and that might be subject to power purchase agreements that are long-term. We'll also be touching upon that in the rest of the presentation. And we'd just like to highlight that there is also an issue with captive plants that are not captured in this system and that we are not covering to a great extent in our research, but just wanted to also have that in the broader picture. Yeah, I'll just be briefly walking you through the different levels of engagement and what we see as the most important commitment levels. So we consider that a development finance institution can engage with the government institutions. They can also engage with the entity and at corporate level and at the asset level itself. So it's important to have credible commitments at these levels, to no new coal plants, but also to phase out the existing plants, as mentioned by Aki earlier, before the end of their technical lifetime. And as much as we think that these commitments are all important, we think that the government level commitment is the most crucial level of commitment in order to address all the potential risks that Aki mentioned earlier, of leakage, moral hazard, and then the other levels of commitment are also important. But yeah, we think that it's best to start with the policy level, national policy level, and then to also consider the commitments that would need to be credible enough at the different other levels. So I'll just present the national policy level engagement. And so just to set the scene here again, if we look at the country commitments to phase out coal at the moment, especially of the countries with the most coal in their electricity mix or that have the biggest pipeline of coal plants at the moment, when we look at the existing initiatives, for example, the Powering Past Coal Alliance or other similar initiatives, we see that there is still lack of commitment at the government level. We may see that for Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia, there is some form of commitment. For example, for Vietnam, no new coal after 2030. But for the Philippines and Indonesia, this commitment is only partial, and it's important to have a broader commitment that really ensures that the efforts are sustained in the long term. So if we look at the barriers that need to be addressed at the policy level, at the government level, so there's the issue of fossil fuel subsidies. We'll get to that later in the presentation. There's the electricity market design, the technical capacity that would need to be built by the different counterparties, the political economy considerations, and the local content regulation. Those are examples of barriers that are specific to the actions that can be implemented at government level and that can be supported by DFIs. So here, just to finish off this part of the presentation focusing on national governments, we'd like to highlight 3 ways to engage. So focusing on technical assistance, for example, development finance institutions can help prioritize the plants that need to be retired and help the governments implement the planning for them to phase out coal plants. Address the contractual barriers, and there are a number of initiatives that are already existing and that are listed here, but this is not comprehensive. There's also sovereign bond issuance. Support with sovereign bond issuance can be key to also drive emission reductions at the country level and further policy commitments. So here we've mentioned the Chile sustainability-linked bond that was issued last year, and that's aligned with the nationally determined contribution of the country. And was the previous green bond that was issued by Chile was supported by IDB, for example. And then one key instrument as well that we see very important with great potential is policy-based lending. And so here the idea is to support the country with its energy sector reform. For example, fossil fuel subsidies have as they need to be reformed. And here there are other actions and policy instruments that can be implemented and that DFIs can support through policy-based lending. And I'll just stop here and hand back over to Aki. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And just on the utility level, and I think this metaphor works a little bit quite well on the national level, but also particularly to the utility level, and even more for vertically integrated utilities. And these are the corporates that can basically really be capturing these savings in many cases. That's the person that could be taking on that mortgage to get out of the rental property and buying a new house. And one major issue is that even if you could, even if you found a house, basically, maybe my household budget actually has a major problem. And this is a case that we see in a number of developing and emerging economies, where basically their utilities do not cover their own costs. And if you can't cover your own costs, you obviously cannot take on the debt and put out that and make that initial investment in order to realize those savings in the next couple of years. And this is just a number of some problems in terms of the cost recovery issues with a couple of utilities. This comes from an IEA report last year, and this is basically what we see as the major barrier on the utility level that is preventing the cost recovery of the utility, the financial health of the utility in general, and preventing them from being able to take on the debt in order to make the investment in the renewables in order to be able to shut down the coal-fired power plants. And these are really the barriers that we need to be addressing in order to enable those utilities to make those investments. And those are from basically billing issues where people are not paying or not paying their bills. In some cases, electricity is stolen from the grid. In some cases, there are multiple different problems. I won't go into them into great detail here, but basically this is a phenomenon that we see in many different countries that is also what we see is the major barrier that is preventing utilities from making that investment. But of course, on the independent power producer level, that's a whole different issue. They're insulated from the savings and the market forces. And in order to talk a little bit about that, my colleague Imogen from New Climate will make us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aki. So yeah, to finish up, I'll look at the role or discuss the role of independent power producers and how public banks can engage here. So as Aki said, there's a big issue with IPPs or independent power producers being shielded from the market, and this is normally happening through power purchase agreements. So as we see a liberalization of the energy market, we are seeing more IPPs involved. And to really allow and facilitate their involvement, to incentivize them, governments and utilities are entering into these PPAs. PPAs are normally 20 plus years. They're locking in the offtake, which of course allows and facilitates bankability of these investments, but at the same time locks in emissions, of course. And this is particularly an issue if we're looking at new plants being built or plants that have been built in the last 5 years, 8 years, as these are quite difficult to get out of course, because they're quite solid or they give legal right. This is, of course, what allows investors or makes them interested, but also really presents quite a big barrier to phase out. So when we considered how to engage, how public banks should engage with IPPs that have PPAs, one of the core things to really think about is the broader policy context, and namely, if there's credible commitment to phase out, as Sarah talked about. And this is really the core in that if this isn't there, particularly with IPPs, there's a big risk of emission leakage. So public banks can engage in kind of pushing for more ambition on the part of national governments, but there's also, when we're looking at this broader policy context, we can also consider whether or not governments are kind of pushing IPPs to also have their own commitments, right? So to have them kind of at two levels, at the government level and also at the IPP level. This is difficult in that, of course, IPPs have a PPA and very little reason to come to the table. But if we look at the case of Chile, where they had a target themselves and then worked with different coal entities in the company or in the country to come up with voluntary commitments. This is something that can happen, and after that is when IDB Invest went in and made a deal with NG there. So I think there's a role for public banks here in kind of pushing for ambition, not only at the government level, but also to kind of push the government to also push IPPs there. There's also a role for public banks in supporting and providing legal support and renegotiating these PPAs. And particularly here, this is because they have expertise and capacity here, but also because something we haven't mentioned yet, but they're very much were involved to some extent in bringing some of these projects online, so have some insights there potentially. And again, when it comes to PPAs, these are quite difficult to get out of. RMI wrote a really interesting a paper earlier this year that talks about 3 different kind of ways to unlock PPAs, termination, replacement, and restructuring, and I would kind of refer you to that report if you're interested in kind of going more in depth there. But still the question is, how do we kind of estimate the compensation, if we want to call it that, for these approaches. So there's kind of 3 ways we can go about that. We can look at and compensate based on foregone operating profit, so how much companies anticipate making. We can look at capital recovery, so allowing them to recover the investment that they've made, but nothing more, so essentially avoiding making a loss. And we can also use the approach of looking at the booking value or the book value there, which just looks at the value at a given point, and but of course there's many questions and assumptions that we have to consider here. So some of the challenges, I won't repeat too many, but again, there's really a difficulty in getting IPPs to come to the table. There's high moral hazard risk. There's the incentive for these IPPs to, of course, try to get compensated as much as possible. Some of the things that Aki said of slowing down maybe some of the action that they might have done otherwise because they're anticipating some kind of concession to phase out. So there is really, I think, a concern when we're talking about public funds and how do we ensure that we're not overpaying potentially and still incentivizing early retirement. So some of the solutions, I'll just talk about 2 briefly that we said are important. The first is market mechanisms. So so we said first market mechanisms to facilitate price discovery. It's important that the banks are going in and promoting transparent and competitive compensation rather than private bilateral negotiations. We can look at the example here of the German reverse auction. Of course, this was done with utilities, but we still see that there could be value here. And just to give kind of a small example of where we see this maybe playing out with the IDB Invest case, there was maybe an opportunity there to include some kind of market-based mechanism, as we had multiple companies in that space that had agreements to phase out. This maybe could have been an opportunity there, is at least a thought. The second mechanism through which public banks can engage is also through this counterparty approach to avoid project-level engagement and to instead engage with investors in the financial chain and to kind of look at a broader picture. And this is particularly important with IPPs in that they're not necessarily, if you only focus on one plant, then there's really a risk of emission leakage. There's also a risk that for one plant, there's multiple parties involved. And so, yeah, having a kind of a broader, bigger picture is, I think, the way to go here. And with that, I'll quickly just conclude our presentation. So we kind of already went all over these things, but we have three kind of sets of recommendations that go at different levels. We have the government level commitment to phase out that Sarah talked about. We have what Aki touched on, which is really focused on how public banks can engage with utilities to change or help them change their business model, to provide different kinds of capacity building and assistance, and also targeted transition finance to allow them and provide kind of fiscal space for them to buy that house. And lastly, what I just went over with IPPs, really promoting transparent and competitive compensation methods and mechanisms where possible to, again, ensure that public funds are being utilized in the best way possible, and also, again, avoiding overcompensation. So that is it for us, and I'll pass it back to Aki.
Thank you, Imogen. With this, we wanted to allow everyone to be sped up on the role of development banks and the potential role that they can play. But it's also interesting to hear from the banks themselves and to see how banks have been implementing this on the ground. And we'll hear from first National Development Bank, and then we'll hear from a couple of multilateral development banks as well. I'll start with Pauline Larat from the French Development Agency, who is joining us online. Good afternoon, Pauline. I believe we have our slides up. So let me know when you want to move forward in the slides, because I control the clicker.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so you will be moving the slides, correct? Okay. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to share our perspective on this very complex agenda. Maybe if we can start next slide, please.
Okay. Actually, you do have control over the slides.
Yeah,
so you
I do have. That's what I was a bit.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I do. So yeah, so maybe I will be just briefly sharing an historical perspective on AFD and coal, just to state that we never, as AFD, financed coal-related projects, and this has become a formal and explicit exclusion since 2013. And then the issue of the early retirement of coal, it has been really stressed in the presentation, but it's very far from business as usual for DFIs. In general, we aim to build new infrastructure, not to retire operational assets. So definitely research is necessary to help us to navigate in this complex subject. So thank you very much for this report and its operational approach, and we try to make the best use of it. I think what we can see in the report is that we definitely need to adopt a systemic approach when we talked about retirement of coal, and there are 3 levels of intervention that we need to support at the same time. So there is the national level, the utility level, and the local level. In particular, you said it was not addressed in the report, but and from AFD perspective, also we believe that this issue of the just dimension, which is at the local level, needs to be addressed as well. And I'll try to share some examples on how we do this. So on the national level, so I think, everybody will agree that for sector planning is driven by 2 priorities. First, energy security, and it must be at the lower cost. So that to engage the country in coal phase out, we really need to demonstrate that yes, we can build on planning, and we can build on a low cost scenario that allows for that address this energy security agenda at a low cost at a low cost aspect. And so this is what at AFD we are providing technical assistance for modeling and to help really the country to have this information that they can engage in this coal phase out. We do also work through policy-based loan, and since it is one of your recommendations, we're happy to follow it. We've been engaged in particular with South Africa in the context of the JETP through a first development policy loan co-financed with KfW, World Bank, and African Development Bank to support in particular the policy environment to promote renewable energy on the system, on the grid. Then when it comes at the utility level, I think there are three main issues I'd like to stress. First, as the same for the national level, you need to work with the utility on energy transition strategy. You need to work on the path for coal decommissioning on a very concrete aspect in terms of timeline and cost. And we are, for example, working with ESCOM on such a JET strategy through a study which is co-financed with GIAP, and we are providing technical assistance for execution of this strategy, which has just been adopted by the board, so it's good news. Then the issue of transition finance. At the moment, we have not explored this option, but this is something that we really want to consider. And of course, all the work that is done through the energy transition strategy will be the baseline, will be the material that will support this kind of transition finance. Because we need to agree with the utilities on specific milestones, that will allow us to make the disbursements. And this, we need to be very careful to ensure additionality of the loan. And so this, we need to be very precautious on this type of engagement, but this is something that we really want to explore, but so far we have not done anything. And then there is the issue of funding itself, the coal decommissioning. So as I said, this is not in our DNA to do this kind of investment because there is no direct return of investment. So that's why we are, we've never been involved in any kind of this transaction. And we are working with ESCOM still on how to work on revenue generating activities such as repowering or repurposing, and we've been involved with them in a cost benefit analysis in selection of some power plants to see how we can engage in this kind of transaction. But definitely, of course, concessional funding is required for this kind of transaction, and that's why we are looking at it. But so far, as I said, we have not been involved. And then. Speaking about the generation of revenues, and then it is really linked to the local aspect, and this comes to the last slides I wanted to share with you. So decommissioning a power plant will have, of course, systemic impact on the communities, and so this is how sorry, I'm lost in my slides. Do you see the local one?
Yes.
Sorry. Yes. So that's why we're trying to work also on this aspect and make sure that the transition leaves no one behind. That's why we look at. We need to demonstrate that is, of course, an opportunity locally through economic diversification, job creation, and reduction of poverty and inequalities. We, for example, in South Africa, we implemented technical cooperation to support economic diversification in the Steve Tshwete local municipality to make them to make the local economy less dependent on the coal industry, looking at local SME fabrics value chain to be developed in this area. We also need to engage with new stakeholders because working on this just aspect means that we need to have more participatory approach. For example, in Senegal, we've been working with a local research center called ENDA, which has engaged in the long-term decarbonization planning of the economy through a participatory approach. So I'm well aware that Senegal is not concerned by coal retirement, but it's just to illustrate how much we need to engage with the local communities and local stakeholders to address this transition. And in South Africa, again, at the request of the presidency, we support the development of the JET Labour Center to respond to a need for a research center to assist trade unions with technical expertise in the context of an energy transition. So just to illustrate how we must engage also in a new way of doing things and financing things. And we cannot only work with utilities. We need to have in mind this complex ecosystem. And finally, we need to work with other financial agents. For example, AFD, we are working through our ADFC and Financing Commons Network to see how this national development bank can infuse this agenda in their mandates. So, for example, we've been working, we have a long-lasting partnership with the PTSMI in Indonesia or DBSA in South Africa, and we're trying to see how we can work on the promotion of local value chains or this kind of local agendas that is necessary if we want to address the early retirement of coal power plants. So these are just some examples of how we can position ourselves on this complex agenda. Just to conclude, we know that, and it has been well stressed in the introduction, we know that subsidies and more generally concessional finance are scarce resources, and they need definitely to be allocated to this early retirement coal agenda. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Pauline. I think in order to enable everyone to continue seeing the slides, I won't invite the panel all to come up at the moment, but rather to enable everyone to see from the audience. But in particular, Pauline, you mentioned your work with various banks that are part of sort of the Financing Summit system, and I think it's a perfect transition. Because I'm very happy to have our next panelist, Gangan Dirgantara from SMI, the Indonesian National Development Bank, who will talk to us about his perspective on the implementation of the energy transition mechanism in Indonesia. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here.
Or you can maybe come here because we have the panelists.
Okay. Thank you for having PRSMI in the panel. And I would like just to share the progress of what we have been doing so far to early retire the coal-fired power plant in Indonesia. So early retirement of coal-fired power plant is one of four focus area on investment under JETP. The early retirement of coal-fired power plant. The second one is to increase the dispatchable renewable energy. The third one is to increase also the variable renewable energy, and the fourth one, the last one, regarding the transmission and distribution. And we are considering to add on one other aspect, which is the supply chain of the renewable energy. Regarding the early retirement of coal-fired power plant, we have been working to try to accelerate the decommissioning of two plants. So the name is Cirebon and Pelabuhan Ratu. One is the capacity. The capacity is 660 megawatt, and the other one around 1.05 megawatt. For the first one, we would like to try to create several financial engineering. First of all, we invite ADB as Multilateral Development Bank to provide loan to this CFPP. So to replace existing loan, so the CFPP can accelerate or can repay the to ADB shorter compared to the existing loan. So we plan to shorten the lifetime 7 years from 2042 to 2035. So that's the first scheme. The second scheme is for the same CFPP, SMI, and together with our National Investment Authority, INA, and GEAP will acquire this CFPP. So we, through this joint venture, we will acquire around 60% of the share of this CFPP. So we hope that through those mechanisms, we can accelerate the lifetime of the CFPP from 2042 to 2035. Similar example or similar strategy we will apply in the other coal-fired power plant. Other than that, we also consider the implication because the closing or retiring of one coal-fired power plant in Indonesia will have quite a large impact, not only on the project scope, but beyond the project scope. So the impact will be on the scale of impact will be interprovincial. Let me give you an example. The CFPP that we would like to close is in Java Island. So the source of coal coming from two main provinces from two different islands. So when we try to, we already conducted the simple modeling for describing the impact of economic of our provincial. We use the interregional input-output model, and then we know that once we close the CFPP and we make some shock in the model, so it will have impact on the region East Kalimantan and South Sumatra. So and the impact will be on the three main sectors. First on mining and manufacturing industry, as well as on transportation. That's, I think, that's why we try to conduct the strategic environmental and social assessment. The framework has been produced by ADB, and also we are supported by other partners to provide the framework of economic and socio-economic framework to analyze the impact beyond the project scope. So I think the cooperation between SMI as National Development Bank and Multilateral Development Bank is very important, as well as to also invite philanthropy and also the think tank, how to solve the problem on the ground. The one important issue, I think, on taxonomy. So as our colleague mentioned earlier, that taxonomy will be the base for a financial institution to provide financing support. So in ASEAN countries, we ASEAN Taxonomy Board already include the early retirement of coal-fired power plant, and in their taxonomy, sustainable taxonomy, and is categorized as green. Indonesia already is in the process to adopt this to become green also in national sustainable taxonomy. SMI recently just issued the sustainable link loan. So we try to invite commercial bank in the area, in Asia, to accelerate also the early retirement of coal-fired power plant. But unfortunately, the bank is consider the taxonomy in their country. So I think interoperability of taxonomy is one issue that should be solved to provide more support to really materialize the early retirement of coal-fired power plant. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Gangan. And I think, I mean, if we're going to be able to solve this, we're not going to be able to solve this without addressing this in Indonesia. So that perspective is really, really important here. And then moving from this national perspective, or bilateral and national perspective, I'd also now like to welcome Nora Lambrecht from IDB Invest. To hear about their perspective and what they've been doing and thinking in this space.
Thank you very much, Aki, and thanks for the plugs already earlier. I saw we already got mentioned. That's wonderful. So yeah, Nora from IDB Invest. So we work with the private sector in Latin America and the Caribbean and in 26 different countries. And I think when one thinks of Latin America and the Caribbean, coal isn't, or coal-fired power generation isn't maybe the thing that comes to mind, because in fact at a regional level the region overall has a very low level. It's only about 4% that is actually coal-fired power generation. However, that seemingly low number is a little bit misleading, because there are some countries, it's pretty concentrated, that have pretty coal-intensive grids, or that are working on, of course, phasing them out, and that's Chile, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic. And I'd like to take a couple of minutes to share a little bit the experience that we were able to gain from working on early coal phase out in Chile. So basically Chile in 2012 had a coal share in their electricity mix of 41%, and by 2022, so last year, it was already down to 23%. So you can really see how they are making a lot of progress. I think Imogen already alluded to that. So what Chile did as part of its energy route 2018 to 2022 is that they convened a working group, like a public-private partnership, where they convened also a bunch of the larger utilities to basically come up with voluntary commitments to phase out coal by 2040. And that's basically where we as IDB Invest, working with the private sector, because it was this relationship with utilities where we saw an opportunity. So a few years ago at COP25, we signed a memorandum of understanding with ENGIE, so with the branch ENGIE Energia Chile, to basically pioneer a new model. So when the representative of AFD was just talking about how difficult it can be to retire coal power plants early for MDBs when you don't actually have an investment project. That's exactly what we saw as well. So what we did, in fact, was we designed a financial instrument to connect it with a new renewable asset. So what we ended up doing in 2021, so it took a little bit of time, is basically that we made a deal with ENGIE to retire 2 units, so one 136 megawatt and one 132 megawatt coal power plants in Tocopilla, and we set sort of the end date. We set at like 2024, so that was sort of our business as usual scenario. I think Aki mentioned earlier how that's also a challenge, right? You don't want to overcount the emissions reductions. You don't just want to be financing business as usual. So we set that sort of as the end date, and we were saying, okay, anything that gets retired before 2024, yay, amazing. And so what we did is we connected it, as I said, to this renewable asset. It's a little bit of a complicated structure, but when you wrap your head around it, really makes sense. So a 151 megawatt, there are a lot of numbers here, 151 megawatt wind farm in the Antofagasta region. So that was basically the asset, a new greenfield asset that we financed. And so the idea basically is we were able to use a 15 million blended finance tranche from the climate investment funds from CIFs for that basically we wanted to monetize the emission reductions between basically the wind plant coming online and that predefined end date of business as usual in 2024. And where are we now? So in 2022, so the wind farm has since now come online since we've made this deal. In 2022, the emissions reductions that we have reported accounted to 132,256 tons of CO2. And of course, then up until 2024, there's more to come. And the idea is that then they can indeed monetize it so that at the end of the loan, we're going to do an interest rate adjustment. That's basically how it would work. And there's another caveat or interesting aspect to it. So we've heard here at COP all the discussions around Article 6, right? And I mean, there's a lot of potential for really Article 6 really coming, getting up and running. So if Chile in the next few years basically develops Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and a mandatory scheme comes online, then basically what they're able to do is they're also able to use those emission credits for their carbon markets. So that is baked in. So for us overall, I mean, we're also working on carbon markets and we're working on developing that in Latin America. And while of course there are important caveats to it, we think that when there is additionality, permanence, equity, all these really important principles, then carbon markets can play an important role. So that's also where that connection is. I think I'll stop there. We want to basically replicate this model. It took a long time to structure, but we really think it has a lot of potential. So currently we're talking to the Dominican Republic, and we're hoping also to learn from our experience. So I was also just very interested to hear about the reflections on our project, how maybe there are, there might be some other potential on how to, on how to do maybe even better next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. And as Pauline says, I think that we're still in very early stages in terms of public banks engaging in this space, and the IDB Invest's role here as an innovator and an early innovator, I think, is also really valuable in providing learnings to others in this space. And now I'd like to turn to our next speaker, Debarata Chattopadhyay from the World Bank, who's joining us online, who will talk to us about the different initiatives that the World Bank is taking on in this space and where the World Bank is in their learnings about this. Deb, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you, Aki.
Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. From a very cold morning in Washington, D.C. So I work for the World Bank, and for the next 5-6 minutes, I'll just give you a very quick outline of some of our activities. And then this kind of goes back to 2018, 2019, when we started working first on China, mainly the Shanxi province. And that particular episode is still sort of unfinished business for us. But the basic sort of outline of the program that we were developing was to actually stop building new coal and even actually stop construction of coal plants that were almost near completion. Now that's where kind of, because we were insisting on actually stopping construction of plants that were ready to be commissioned in a couple of months, that did not go down very well. So that's why that's still an ongoing dialogue. But actually that gave us a lot of insights into what we can do. And sort of it was a time for us to do some introspection and see actually what's the full complexity of these value chain that a coal plant brings. And as Pauline sort of pointed out, that's where we focused quite a bit on national level planning and understand actually what it takes to retire a coal plant, forget about coal plants that are about to be commissioned, but also mid-life, like say 20 plus years, or very new coal plants, what does it take to retire? And then the short sort of summary of all of those analyses that we did, not only for China, but also for India, South Africa, Philippines, Indonesia, etc., was that we are probably better off looking at sort of low-hanging fruits, which are actually in the sort of more mature coal plants. I'm talking about 25 plus years old. And in India alone, there's a lot of them. I mean, there are actually 30 plus year plants that add up to about 40 gigawatt in India. And we calculated the stranded asset cost. A lot of those studies are in the public domain. Very briefly, we are looking at, on average, for the entire coal fleet, $300 to $400 per kilowatt stranded asset. But if you look at the 30 plus year old plants, they are basically negative because they are a kind of a burden on the system. Now, so it obviously makes sense to retire those, and that's where we also unfortunately get pretty close to this moral hazard issue. If those plants are have these benefits rather than benefits to the system, should we put money into them? But then I think, like when we went down to actual sort of field level exercise, going to some of these power plants, talking to them, then we realized that the overall problem is much more complex, and it's far easier to actually knock down some of these older coal plants, keep some of their employment alive by repurposing the site. And for example, if we put up battery storage, PV plants on the existing coal plant site, that's actually a pretty good model. And it also avoids the uncomfortable issue of stranded asset cost, because actually there is no payment involved for a lot of those plants. So that's kind of like the basic business model that went into our sort of accelerating coal transition program, which we are at the moment doing in several countries. And there's sort of a second level of countries. After the first 4 countries, we are now looking at the next 4. And it's kind of like it's going well. I mean, you probably most of you know about this South African initiative. We are trying to do things in India across our 4 plants, which is going to add up to more than about 1.5 gigawatt, I would say. And the other sort of big component of all of these projects is the just transition, which has already been touched upon. But one thing I just wanted to mention is that if we are talking about a coal plant repurposing exercise, we are mainly talking about investment in renewables on the site itself. That's kind of the business model we are still pursuing. And a typical gigawatt coal plant will be replaced with about $450 odd million. That's, I think, pretty close to the number in South Africa. And the just transition component, which is extremely important, is still relatively low at around 40 million, so less than 10% of the overall investment. It's critical, but it's actually not the game changer. But that's the most complex thing to design, so it requires a lot of effort on our part. But it's extremely doable. So I think, like I'm probably going to run out of time. So I would say that we have a pretty extensive program. We have a lot of ambition. We have more challenges. If I get some time to talk about the risks associated later on, I'll touch upon those, but I'll stop there for now. Thank you. Back to you, Aki.
Thank you, Deb. And I think that this issue of the potential reuse and repurposing of the site is really important, and is a particularly important consideration in when we think about the book value. What is also the value of the site? What is the value of the grid connections existing there? I've heard that that's also a very important consideration in Chile and many other countries. Let me now turn to the representatives of a couple of think tanks and academics on our panel. We now have Rishikesh Rambandari from Boston University, who is also working on very, very related research. And the floor is yours to hear the direction your research is going.
Great, thank you so much, Aki, and it's great to be here with all of you. A lot of what I was going to say has already been said in one way or the other, so I'm going to slightly sort of fine-tune what I was going to say, and I'll just say three things. Number one is that we often talk about renewable energy targets in terms of capacity additions when we talk about coal retirement. But I think what we're seeing increasingly is not necessarily substitution, that is renewable energy additions not necessarily substituting out coal immediately, but actually more of a layering approach, right? So where capacity is coming online, but you still have coal-fired power plants active. Now, what makes it slightly more challenging is that, and of course this varies depending on which country we're talking about, but just because you add renewable energy capacity does not actually mean it's going to come online, right? And so in terms of what exactly is the actual use, so not just the capacity installation, but the actual use of renewable energy once it's actually installed is another important factor. And we've seen this in a number of countries where the government will make announcements regarding renewable energy targets, but there isn't necessarily a commitment to actually use the power. And so, a number of places there are actually concerns that maybe I remember doing interviews in a country which I won't say exactly where that was, but an official saying that this is more of a procurement target than a use target. Right, and so I think there is that view of how exactly would the new renewable energy capacity really actually enter the energy mix. So that's sort of one thing to think about. Second is the financial health of off-takers, which Aki and others have already also highlighted how important and crucial that really is to make sure that deals are actually able to close. In a number of places, we see how long the process is to actually close on these projects, and oftentimes that's directly a consequence of the financial health of the utilities. And so I think as we think about making sure that there is that energy security, which has been highlighted as a top-line concern, how do we really make sure that the utilities are actually able to really demonstrate that commitment, which is I think another sort of a common word that we heard in a number of presentations, to actually make good on those policy commitments. And finally, what I will also sort of add is that whether it's in Chile or in a number of other examples, precisely because of the not just the moral hazard sort of issue, but also in terms of making sure that there is the regulatory certainty as well, that the high-level policy commitment is so crucial. And I think Chile's case is definitely instructive in terms of really making sure that various actors feel like they have a stake in the process, and therefore there is a more of a dialogue sort of a based approach in which there really is ownership into the coal retirement agenda. And so I think it's and we've heard also in the case of South Africa, for example, in terms of the local communities and how they may be impacted by the transition. the different ways in which stakeholder views can really be brought in to make sure that just transition piece, which is so crucial, can really be a part of that discussion. And so, so of course, so just to sort of, underscore the really, the very crucial need for policy commitment, which again, I think goes back to the more systemic view that I think, many of the speakers have really alluded to, because there's, of course, the plant level economics, but there's also the wider, what you could call spillover impacts, right, of the coal phase out, but also the broader policy ecosystem in which these decisions are, taking place. So, yeah, just to sort of, underscore the need to really think about the nature of the policy commitment, but also to take a really systemic view as we think about how exactly can a early coal phase out really be made to work. So yeah, let me pause there and yeah, pass it back to Aki. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasheen. Yeah, and we were very actually happy to hear that there was a parallel research going on at Boston University. So we have a bit of a sparring partner in that. And last but not least, I'll give the floor to Chris Beaton from the International Institute for Sustained Development. And he's been working on basically fossil fuel subsidy reform for a number of years now. And I think that's one of the major barriers that we're thinking about in terms of what is really preventing an accelerated phase out. So I'm very happy to have his perspective on this as well. Clicker.
Thank you very much, Aki. So I'm going to maybe step back a little and just going to think about the wider context in which we're talking about this topic. Aki said I've been working on fossil fuel subsidy reform for a long time, and he's right. It's been about 14 years. And although we're talking about how do we provide public support for the early retirement of coal-fired power, one of the bigger problems at an overall global context is actually we're really, really good at providing public support for fossil fuels. The problem is getting rid of it. So we've been talking about it for a really long time. We've had commitments for a really long time, and it's not been going anywhere. So, in your presentation, you talked about, moral hazard, you talked about kind of transition washing, but part of the other risks we've got is, okay, well, we've got these big global commitments. They've not been moving fast enough. And then also if we have these sorts of kind of gray areas that aren't well defined enough, what does that do for the political will and the accountability that we need in some of these kind of bigger picture issues on the phase out of fossil fuels in general? So I'll just share some data on this, which you may have seen. So this comes from a publication that we brought out just before COP. It was a bit of a primer, just to kind of get people up to date with the latest data on this topic. There's a big community of actors working on this data, so we've not been producing it all ourselves. We've been trying to bring it together. So, this is the IEA, the OECD, the IMF on international public finance. It's Oil Change International, and obviously we've been filling in little bits of gaps ourselves as well. So what we found from this exercise is in 2022, we had record support, public financial support for fossil fuels. It was 1.7 trillion. I was at an IRENA event earlier this week, and that was magically exactly the same number that they estimated is required per year in investments for clean energy. Actually, we have new data now, so I've been on Teams with a colleague who's crunching the latest data from the OECD. The OECD published their data on the 3rd of December, and we're just kind of adding it all up, and we think the final total is actually 1.9 trillion for 2022. And even then, there's still big gaps. There's tons of non-transparency in this area where it's very hard to even identify some of the subsidies that exist, let alone measure them. And also, there are big parts of this data set which are just really incomplete. So on the side of public finance, our estimates are just for the G7 and MDBs. And on SOEs, our data is just from the G20. So kind of huge shadow support levels kind of sitting under all of this as well. So what does this mean? I think that one of the challenges that we're seeing in global agreements in this space is right now we're looking at kind of the wrong test. So for years, really, since the G20 committed to reform fossil fuel subsidies for the first time in 2009. It was a long time ago. They said they would do it in the medium term, so we're stretching the definition, but hey-ho. They've used this language that we need to reform inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So what's being created is almost kind of a test where like you need to first prove it's inefficient and then you'll reform it, rather than us assuming, hey, you know what, all fossil fuel subsidies are inefficient, but maybe there are rare circumstances where you need to prove that you found one that there's a good case for. So I kind of feel like that's what we're talking about today. Like there are good cases to be chatting about this and to talk about this necessary finance, but also I think we need really rigorous definitions, because if we don't have them, then we start to kind of re-enter this really unhelpful space where accountability has been very difficult. This week we were all hopeful that we might have seen inefficiency killed, but nope, it's not. So we saw the latest text come out an hour ago, and it's back. So it was probably too good to be true. But yeah, I think these things are kind of real, and we need to take them seriously. I think in this context as well, the Clean Energy Transition Partnership is really interesting. So, you know, this slide you can see here shows the data specifically for international public finance on for support for fossil fuels. And it's actually the one area where trends are going in the right direction. So in subsidies and SOE reform, we really don't see any change happening at all. But thanks to initiatives like the Clean Energy Transition Partnership, where kind of a group of leading countries agreed, okay, we're going to stop international public finance for fossil fuels, we've really seen things start to change. And one of the things that really made that initiative stand out was this bold language, which was saying, you know, we're just going to stop support. So, you know, if we're talking about these conditions under which support is needed and is an important part of transition, again, that precision, I think, is really required. Because when we've got bolder and clearer commitments, we can see that we get results. That's it.
Thank you, Chris. I can actually invite all the panelists to come up to have a bit more of a discussion here. And I'll note that it's not only that we're talking now about phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, but the current decision text that landed it was inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption and do not address energy poverty or just transition. So there's a couple of other hurdles that we need to be thinking about, at least according to the current decision text draft. But maybe Chris, since you went last, I'll ask your perspective on this transition finance question. And if you, from your work and in your 17 years in working on fossil fuel subsidy reform, if you have any perspectives on making sure that transition finance doesn't end up being a fossil fuel subsidy in disguise.
Testing? Is this working? Yes. Okay. It's been 14 years, not 17. So give me another 3. Give me another 3, and we'll have solved the problem. Well, I think I don't feel like I'm an expert on this topic in particular, and I feel like I learned a lot from listening to the discussions today. So a huge thanks to everybody else so far. A few things that I resonated with me, I think, from your kind of own presentation was obviously just this issue of credibility. So I won't repeat what you've already said, but I just kind of emphasize that I think that seems absolutely essential. So if we don't have credible commitments, providing kind of finance for early retirement doesn't seem like a good idea. I think another thing that I very much enjoyed from your presentation was the need for finance to support fossil fuel subsidy reform. So I also won't report that, but it's a really good idea. It is needed. I mean, I'm partly speaking in exaggerated terms for the sake of entertainment, but it is actually very hard. So one of the reasons fossil fuel subsidy reform isn't happening is not only political will. Political will is part of it, but there are also a really bunch of complicated impacts that happen when you try to make this change happen. Indonesia has had a lot of experiences with this. So I think that this technical assistance piece is important. As a non-expert, I would throw out a few other ideas, but take them with a pinch of salt in case they're not well thought through. So one would be transparency. So we struggle to track public finance for fossil fuels because a lot of it is very, very non-transparent. So in my data set I shared with you, we only have data on international public finance. It's extremely expensive to get access to databases that even let you try to tally this. And it's a lot of work to crunch through them. So there is currently no equivalent data on domestic public finance. As far as I'm aware, there's some interesting studies. CPI have done great work in South Africa, for example. But if we don't even know what's being lent, it's very hard to feel confident that it's being lent credibly. So, A, what are lending practices, and B, if we are creating these tough tests that people need to meet to show that this is appropriate, well, then we need credibility, we need transparency on what are these tests and have they been passed or not. Another piece that jumped out to me was from Pauline. So just additionality. I think, is this a phase out that's going to happen anyway? Because if so, do we really need to provide lending? So I just think that seems like a key point to solve. Two more, if I can sneak them in. I like talking about ethics and justice. I know it's really hard in this space, but I think that a lot of these conversations are motivated by the fact that there are countries who have played a much smaller role in causing climate change, who've got very young coal-fired power fleets, and I think it's certainly interesting to try to add a layer of thinking about actually, well, what are the circumstances, who are the entities who are being lent to, how have they behaved, even what was the international assistance that may have caused them to create some of the assets in the first place, that are fossil assets that were maybe built 10 years ago under a different set of expectations about what the future was going to look like, and which weren't only driven by national decision making. So I think some of these questions certainly bear on me in terms of kind of fairness and how we weigh up fairness. And then lastly, maybe just proportionality. So we were providing comments on this GFAN set of guidelines on private sector finance for early retirement of coal power. And one of the things that kind of emerged in a draft text was saying, fossil fuel subsidies are really big. We could reallocate all of them. And they could just help us finance the retirement of coal power. And I mean, you could, but there are a lot of other ways that we also need to reallocate money for all of the other aspects of climate change that need to be financed. So in terms of proportionality, I think it's also kind of coming also on top of these risks, right? That we're very good at subsidizing fossil fuels. I think it would look very worrying if we saw kind of finance flow disproportionately into this area without kind of thinking about how it fits into the role that financial institutions are playing supporting other aspects of transition as well. So what are those proportions and what are the norms we're trying to create about what we're financing? So sorry for the long list. I hope that was a useful set of suggestions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Deb, I think you alluded already to sort of some of your work in this space, especially interacting with stakeholders in India and China and elsewhere. I don't know if you have some further insights about how to manage risks in these questions around early retirement.
Sure, thanks, Aki. So more or less continue from where I stopped. I see that the biggest risk is still this sense of unease between financing agencies, policymaking bodies, international donors, and the governments. So we are kind of trying to almost force a pace on accelerated retirement of coal that the countries, the utilities, the regulators in the countries are not really comfortable with. And I think, then it sort of leads to the question of how do we resolve that? That's, of course, the trillion-dollar question I don't really have an answer to. But I think, there's sort of a lot of room for understanding mutual concerns. Why is it that we want the coal fleet in India to disappear in 20 years when they want 40 years? So I think, is there a sort of a happy middle ground? Similar things, dialogues are happening in Indonesia, also in Vietnam and all other places. So I think in order to sort of develop a better dialogue there, I think we need to understand what the system security concerns are. And we have seen over the last couple of years how the trend of coal transition has changed, even in Europe. that if we actually ask these people to actually retire their coal plants and also commit to building no more new coal plants, they're actually losing an option on the ground, which they have. So I actually have a lot of sympathy with the governments, and I think we need sort of fairly focused studies to understand where we should actually intervene and at what pace. And where we should intervene, that's where, again, I sort of repeat my earlier point that I still feel that the model that we are trying to promote through accelerating coal transition, trying to actually retire some of the plants that are relatively old, expensive, inefficient, operating at 20 to 30% capacity utilization, they are better candidates than a brand new plant. Although the latter would actually save a lot more CO2, that's much harder to get to. And I think that's where the other risk is actually with all these financing agencies, including the MDBs, including us, falling over each other to finance. So there's a little bit of unhealthy competition with the tendency to sweeten the deal more than it needs to be. For example, I mean, I mentioned the term, the sort of the estimate that the stranded asset cost on average should be around 300 to 400. That's average across the whole fleet. The number starts negative, goes over $1 million per megawatt, and or $1,000 per kilowatt, if you like. And some of the estimates that have come out is actually well over $1,000 per kilowatt, up to $2,000 per kilowatt. And if we start doing that, there will be two things. Yes, we'll be actually retiring relatively new plant probably that are actually quite efficient and not as polluting as the older ones. So there's a sort of a loss of efficiency, technical efficiency. The other bigger problem is that we'll actually run out of the limited concessional financing very, very quickly. So that's sort of another risk. The third risk, and I'll stop there, is the technology slate. What do you actually do with these coal plant sites? Where do we actually move to? Now, one of the models that we were trying to promote and still doing it in South Africa, trying to do it in other places as well, is you put up lots of battery storage, PV, etc. And we are not really sort of tied to those options by any means. But what we are actually increasingly hearing is things like biomass, conversion of the coal plants to biomass, starting with a small amount of co-firing, and then eventually move to ammonia and hydrogen and so on. And I think, like that's one space where we don't have very good clarity in terms of what should be the best set of technical options for repurposing old coal plants. But yeah, I think there's a risk that we might be actually hanging our hopes on technologies that are not yet fully commercially viable, for example, conversion to ammonia. And if you look at the latest sort of power development plan for Vietnam, they are certainly hanging on to that big time. So they are actually slowing to some extent their renewable investments, and with the hope that they will be able to continue with their existing coal fleet running on ammonia, but the technology is not proven yet. So those are kind of like my broad sense of sort of risks that we need to address, and then hopefully quite quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. And maybe also, I mean, I think this issue of working simultaneously with policymakers, but also the private sector at the same time is really key here, and working with the overall context and also utilities. And maybe turning to Nora, maybe you can talk a little bit more about how IDB internally also works between IDB and IDB Invest, and how that cooperation can help us with the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of our great assets as IDB Invest, that we have the sister or brother or cousin or whatever it is, I don't know, the IDB public side with us. So I already alluded to what we are currently trying to do in the Dominican Republic. So I'm just going to use this a bit as an example because I think it's quite illustrative. So the Dominican Republic has like a third of its electricity mix is coal currently. I mean, they are ramping up renewables quickly. We actually closed a month ago the largest renewables financing in the Caribbean. So a bunch of solar and wind, very exciting, and talking about sort of what is actually technically feasible. I mean, the Dominican Republic is an island, so it's with limited space, so it's even more challenging there. And on top of that, so the Dominican Republic is an interesting case because they got recently, at the beginning of the year, they got invited to join the Accelerating Coal Transition Investment Program, the ACT program, by the Climate Investment Funds with a, I think it's $85 million investment program. And basically the Dominican Republic then in the spring selected the IDB, so the IDB group, to coordinate this program. And this is really where this cooperation comes in. So the IDB is advising the Dominican Republic on how can they phase out their coal plants, but at the same time we financing the private sector. And given that the largest, the 3 oldest coal assets are actually privately owned in the Dominican Republic, we can leverage our experience from the Chile project that I just talked about, and also link that then again to Article 6. So that also alludes a little bit, I think, to the ethics question, because of course, I mean, with all the issues there are around carbon markets, I mean, if we can make carbon markets work, then that also provides a source of financial sustainability and an option to finance such projects, right? Particularly in countries that have contributed very little to climate change. So yeah, not that much to report yet, but we're very excited, and the collaboration between IDB and IDB Invest is definitely key to making this work, to just, you know, navigate the government and the private sector.
Thanks, Norm. I just hope that those reductions in one place are not offset by increased emissions somewhere else. That's a kind of a major issue with Article 6. But we're running a little short on time, but maybe very quickly, Rishi, can I ask the same question from you about if you have any insights about how, about how bilateral development banks and other DFIs can best engage to support the transition. I'm sorry? I'm sorry. wait, no, sorry. What are the major barriers to restructuring utilities? Apologies.
I'm happy to answer the
or
one
whichever you like.
Yeah, no, I'll say 2 things. One is I think it's engagement at the policy level is also given the fact that many MDBs have regular policy dialogues with their client governments, there is an important opportunity for the policy discussions to take place, and so I think that's one very important value addition that the MDBs or DFIs more generally can really bring to the table. But now in terms of barriers, something that we need to, I think, unpack a bit is in terms of how the standards piece will really develop. And here, this is sort of multiple layers. One is, how does this fit in with the exclusion criteria that MDBs have? That's sort of one piece. The second piece is in terms of, as we think more broadly in terms of taxonomies, how exactly would the transition, in terms of risks, right? How exactly would the transition finance piece work in a way that doesn't further incentivize the entrenchment of coal? And so I think that's another sort of standards piece that we need to make sure that we pay attention to, so that we don't create a situation where we simply amplify some of these risks. Pause there.
Thanks, Rishi. And yeah, I would have given you the freedom to answer either of those questions. But maybe just sort of in conclusion, as we are running short on time, maybe the sort of last thoughts from Gangan and Pauline about maybe also the sort of collaboration between bilateral and national development banks, maybe starting with Gangan.
Yes, back to the project I mentioned earlier, we are talking about the project cost of $800 million US, and also book value is around that number. So it is quite huge for an institution like us. I think blended finance is important. That's why we encourage the participation and involvement of different stakeholders to make it real. The other problem is we cannot, since we talk about just transition, no one left behind. So I think we need to also encourage the coal sector stakeholders. So in Southeast Asia now, there are some platform also like just energy transition, but we have also just coal transition partnership in order to fine-tuning both sides, how to boost this clean energy, while the coal stakeholders also can participate to the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Gangan. And maybe, Pauline, do you have the sort of final thoughts in terms of your collaboration and your experience between the Agence Française de Développement and National Development Banks?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And very briefly, as I said, of course, we need to work through our existing networks such as IDFC. And at the moment, we have not engaged in specific work together on really how to address this issue of financing early retirement of coal. But at AFD, we are managing a technical assistance facility, and we definitely need to see how we can put this issue of coal retirement on the roadmap of our common work with our partners through this technical assistance facility to better articulate our efforts and to learn from each other's. Because yes, it's very new, so we all need to be together to know and to share our practices in this respect.
Thank you, Pauline. And I think we're actually at time. If there are any really pressing questions from the audience, maybe we can take one or two questions. But I do realize we are at basically the end of 2 weeks, 2 very, very long weeks of negotiations. And here in Dubai, we're already quite late in the evening. So if there are no pressing questions, yeah, I invite you to reach out to the panelists. I think they're all willing to react and engage with you. And I hope you will look forward to our research, and I hope to have your feedback on our research as well when we come out with sort of the next steps of our publication process in early next year. Thank you really very much to all the panelists for staying so late, so late in the day, so late in the comp. And I hope we can all engage together to really accelerate an early and very and a coal phase out very, very soon. Thank you very much.